When the judge slammed that final verdict, everyone thought it was over. An innocent man sentenced to die, forgotten by the world, everyone except his dog. What that German shepherd did next, it didn't just shake the town, it forced the truth out of the shadows. This is not just a story about justice, it's a story about loyalty, pain, and a bond so deep, it defied everything we know about animals and people. When Daniel Carter was wrongfully sentenced to death, the world moved on, but one creature couldn't, his German shepherd Max. What Max did, day after day, minute by minute, uncovered a trail no one expected, and in the end, it was Max who stood taller than any man in the courtroom. You won't believe how this all unfolds. Daniel Carter had always been a man of few words. At 32, he was the kind of person most people overlooked, a mechanic by trade. His life was simple, predictable, and free from any desire for grandeur. In a small, tight-knit town, Daniel had a reputation, mostly for being quiet and hardworking. People knew his name, but few knew his story, or cared to. He wasn't the type to share his problems or boast about his achievements. He kept to himself, finding peace in the mundane rhythm of his daily life. His modest home, tucked away at the edge of town, was barely more than a rented space, with peeling paint and a creaky door. His truck, an old beater with rusted panels and a stubborn engine, was his pride and joy. It wasn't much, but it got him from point A to point B, and in his world, that was all that mattered. He didn't need fancy things or the approval of others. What mattered to him most was his dog Max. Max wasn't just any dog. He was more than a pet. He was Daniel's companion, his confidant, his family. They had been through everything together, from childhood memories of chasing balls in the yard to the quiet nights spent in front of the television. Max had been there. Raised since a pup, Max was a trained German shepherd, known for his intelligence and unwavering loyalty. The kind of dog who could sense Daniel's moods, even before Daniel himself knew what he was feeling. If Daniel was stressed, Max would nudge his hand, gently reminding him to calm down. If Daniel was upset, Max would lay his head in his lap, silently offering comfort without asking for anything in return. They were inseparable, two souls bound by an unspoken understanding. But on one rainy morning, everything changed. The kind of change that rips through your life like a thunderstorm, leaving behind destruction in its wake. It wasn't just a shift in Daniel's routine. It was a storm that swept away everything he had known, everything he thought was secure. And it started with a body. Claire Reynolds, a young woman in her early 20s, had been found dead in a wooded area just outside town. The scene was grim, her body lying in the mud, her life cut short by an unknown hand. She was the mayor's niece, a well-known figure in the community, and the news of her death spread like wildfire. Everyone was talking about it. The small town that had always been so quiet, so predictable, was suddenly filled with whispers, accusations, and fear. But it wasn't just the tragedy of her death that shook Daniel's world. It was the fact that somehow he was caught in the middle of it all. Daniel had known Claire. In a small town, you didn't escape everyone's radar, even if you tried. He had once worked on her car, nothing more than a routine oil change. But it was enough. To the authorities, to the town's gossipers, it was enough to tie him to her death. He didn't have an airtight alibi. He had been home that night, but no one could vouch for him. The timing was fuzzy. The evidence was non-existent, but that didn't matter. People didn't care about the truth. They wanted answers, and Daniel was the easiest answer. A man without a strong defense, a man who lived alone, a man with nothing to lose. The trial was swift, too swift. A court case that should have taken months was wrapped up in a matter of weeks. The evidence, almost non-existent. No fingerprints, no DNA, no clear motive. There was nothing to link Daniel to Claire's murder. Nothing except the circumstances. He had worked on her car once. That was enough to seal his fate. The defense team barely put up a fight. They weren't given time to gather witnesses or evidence. The town was in a rush for justice, and they had already decided who was guilty. The town was loud, its whispers turning into cries for retribution. The pressure mounted. The mayor's niece, a beloved figure, had been killed. Someone had to pay, and Daniel, with his humble life and quiet nature, became the perfect scapegoat. Daniel didn't fight it. He couldn't. The weight of the world had already crushed him. He sat through the trial with his eyes downcast, his hands trembling. He didn't speak up in his own defense. There was no use. He knew how the town felt about him. He knew they had already made up their minds. And then the verdict came. The judge slammed down the gavel, his voice booming across the courtroom, sealing Daniel's fate. Guilty. The word echoed in Daniel's ears like a distant thunderclap. His chest tightened, his stomach turned. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. But what shocked everyone in the room was Daniel's reaction. There were no tears, no outbursts, just a hollow emptiness that filled him up and drained him at the same time. He didn't cry, not even when the death sentence was handed down. His mind went numb, his body went still. He felt as though he were floating, detached from reality. But Max cried when the doors to the courtroom closed behind Daniel, sealing him away in his prison cell. It was Max who felt the loss first. Max, who had never been apart from his master for long, was left alone in their small house. For days, Max refused to eat. He paced the house endlessly, sniffing the door, looking out the window. Every night, Max would lie down by the front door, his eyes never leaving the empty street. His ears would perk up at the slightest sound, hoping, praying, that Daniel would return. But Daniel didn't come. Neighbors who passed by the house began to notice Max's behavior. Some thought it was just a dog missing his owner. Others, more superstitious, whispered that Max could sense something they couldn't, that Max knew the truth, even if no one else did. One elderly woman, Mrs. Parkins, who lived 2 houses down, swore she saw Max sitting outside the courthouse every morning, staring up at the building with an intensity she had never seen before in an animal. It was as though Max was waiting for something. But what? Max wasn't just waiting. He wasn't just missing Daniel. He was listening, watching. He was paying attention to something no one else was. And it wasn't long before Max's actions began to catch the attention of others. As days turned into weeks, Max's behavior grew more erratic. The small town that had once seemed so familiar, so safe, suddenly felt foreign to Daniel. It was as though the very air had changed, charged with tension, with whispers of doubt and guilt hanging like storm clouds over everyone's heads. People had started to talk about Max's strange actions. Mrs. Parkins wasn't the only one who noticed. There were others too, neighbors who swore they had seen Max sitting at the courthouse steps every day, his eyes locked onto the building with a fierce intensity. Some thought it was just a dog's loyalty, waiting for his master to return, a creature of habit caught in the grip of routine. But there were others who whispered about something more. "Have you seen the dog at the courthouse?" One man had asked another. "He's there every morning, staring, like he knows something. They say dogs can sense things." The second man replied, "Maybe he knows what really happened." The rumor spread quickly, picking up momentum like a snowball rolling downhill. But no one paid attention to the deeper meaning. They were quick to dismiss it as the grief of an animal losing its owner. No one could see what was right in front of them, the bond between Daniel and Max, the silent communication they shared, the way Max understood things beyond what was visible. Then, one night, Max did something that caught the attention of someone who mattered. Officer Ryan Brooks, a young cop who had grown up in the town and had known Daniel since childhood, was working late in the station when he received a call. It was Mrs. Parkins, her voice trembling with urgency. "You need to come, Ryan," she said. Her words rushed. "Max, he's acting strange again. You need to see him." Ryan wasn't sure what to make of the call. After all, it was just a dog, but something about Mrs. Parkins' tone gave him pause. It sounded almost like she was afraid, like she knew something he didn't. When Ryan arrived at Daniel's house, he was met by an eerie silence. The lights were off, and there was no sign of life. But as he approached the porch, he saw Max sitting there, as usual, his eyes fixed on the door, his body rigid with tension. Max didn't move as Ryan stepped closer, but his gaze never wavered. It was as if the dog knew he was being watched, but didn't care. Ryan crouched down beside him, trying to calm the dog with a gentle pat on the head. But Max's response was anything but calming. The dog's breathing was rapid, his muscles taut, and his eyes, those intense, intelligent eyes, seemed to flicker with something more than just confusion or longing. Max's behavior was nothing like the quiet, composed dog Ryan remembered. There was an urgency in his eyes, something primal, as though he was trying to communicate a truth that no one else could understand. Ryan, unable to shake the feeling that something wasn't right, made his way inside the house. As he stepped over the threshold, he was hit by the smell of dust and emptiness. The house hadn't been lived in for weeks, and the silence felt oppressive. Max followed him in, his movements tense, as though he were waiting for something to happen. Ryan paused in the living room, looking around. There was nothing unusual about the place, nothing out of the ordinary. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he spotted something on the floor. A set of footprints, muddy, wet tracks leading toward the back door. Ryan frowned. He wasn't sure why, but a chill ran down his spine as he examined the prints. They didn't belong to Max. They were too large, too deliberate, and they led out the door, toward the backyard and beyond. Without thinking, Ryan followed the trail of prints, his heart pounding in his chest. Max, as if sensing the shift in the air, stayed close behind him, his body low to the ground, his ears perked. The trail led them into the woods, not far from where Claire Reynolds' body had been discovered. Ryan had been out here before, combing the area for any sign of evidence, any clue that might point to who had committed the crime. But this time, it felt different. The air was thick with tension, and the trees seemed to close in around him, as though they were guarding a secret. And then, just as he was about to turn back, something caught his eye, a glint of metal, partially buried beneath a pile of leaves. Ryan's heart skipped a beat. He knelt down, brushing the leaves away, and uncovered a small, shiny object. It was a keychain, Claire's keychain, the one she had been carrying the day she disappeared. His breath caught in his throat. This was it, the evidence he had been searching for, the thing that would finally prove Daniel's innocence. Or so he thought. As Ryan held the keychain in his hand, he realized that something else was off. He looked up, scanning the woods, trying to make sense of what had just happened. How had Max known to lead him here? Why had the dog brought him to this exact spot, at this exact moment? Max had never been this intuitive before. There was something about the way the dog had moved, the way he had guided Ryan, that sent a shiver down his spine. And then, as if on cue, Max let out a low, guttural growl, his eyes darting toward the trees. Ryan froze. Something was out there. Something or someone. The silence that followed was deafening. Max's growl echoed through the trees, a low and warning sound that made the hairs on the back of Ryan's neck stand on end. He could feel it, the sense that something or someone was watching them from the shadows. His pulse quickened. The quiet of the woods had become unsettling. It wasn't just the darkness. It was the weight of knowing that something was amiss, something hidden in plain sight. Ryan stood perfectly still, listening for any sound that might give away the presence of whoever or whatever was out there. The air felt thick, almost oppressive. Even the wind had died down, as if holding its breath. Max, however, wasn't frozen in fear. He was focused. His body was tense, every muscle coiled in anticipation. The dog's eyes were locked on a patch of trees ahead of them, and for the first time, Ryan realized that Max wasn't just acting on instinct. He was leading him. "Easy, boy," Ryan whispered, trying to calm the dog. But Max wasn't listening. Instead, the dog took a slow, deliberate step forward, and then another, his nose twitching as if sniffing out something hidden deep within the woods. Max's growl softened, replaced by a low whimper, the kind Ryan had only ever heard when the dog was anxious. But it wasn't fear. It was more like determination, as though Max had already made up his mind about what he was going to find. "Where are you taking me?" Ryan murmured, but the dog didn't answer. Instead, he pushed forward, leading Ryan deeper into the trees. Ryan followed, his hand instinctively resting on his gun, his senses sharp. The sound of their footsteps crunching on the dried leaves seemed too loud, breaking the silence that had once seemed so peaceful. They reached a small clearing, and there, lying half-buried beneath a cluster of fallen branches, was something that made Ryan's breath catch in his throat. It was a pair of shoes. Not just any shoes, Claire Reynolds' shoes. Her distinctive, expensive heels. Ryan immediately crouched down, pulling the branches away with trembling hands. He felt his stomach twist. These weren't just any shoes. These were the ones Claire had been wearing the day she disappeared. But what were they doing out here? And why were they buried? As Ryan examined the shoes, his mind raced. Could they have been left behind by someone who had been involved in the crime? And why hadn't anyone noticed them before? Max, ever the silent companion, stood still beside Ryan, his nose twitching as if he, too, understood the gravity of the situation. Ryan's eyes darted around the clearing, his heart pounding in his chest. And then, his gaze landed on something else, a small, blood-stained piece of cloth, barely visible beneath the leaves. He carefully retrieved it, his fingers trembling. It was a torn sleeve from a jacket that matched the pattern of clothing worn by someone in town, someone whose name Ryan knew all too well. It was the mayor's son, Dylan. The blood on the fabric wasn't a coincidence. Ryan's mind raced, connecting the dots. The more he thought about it, the more certain he became. Dylan had been in this area. He had to have been. Max's soft whimper broke through Ryan's thoughts. The dog's gaze was locked onto a large, moss-covered rock near the edge of the clearing. Without thinking, Ryan stood up and moved toward the rock, his steps quickening. Something about it felt wrong, too deliberate, too positioned. As Ryan approached the rock, his heart skipped a beat. Underneath it, Partially obscured by dirt and debris was a small tin box. His fingers trembled as he brushed the dirt away, revealing the box. He opened it slowly, and inside, there were more shocking findings: an old, cracked cell phone and a cigarette lighter, the kind that could only belong to someone with money. Ryan's breath caught in his throat. The phone, though cracked, still showed signs of life. When he pressed the power button, he could make out Claire's name on the screen. But more telling was the lighter, engraved with initials that Ryan recognized immediately. It was Dylan's lighter. Max stood beside him, his eyes now following Ryan's every move, his tail stiff with urgency. There was no mistaking it now. The evidence was undeniable. Dylan was involved. He had been here, and Max had led him straight to the truth. Max's growl returned, low and menacing, as though warning Ryan to tread carefully. Ryan had seen this behavior before. Max didn't just sense danger, he sensed betrayal. Ryan stood still, the gravity of the situation weighing down on him. He knew what he had to do, but he couldn't do it alone. This wasn't something he could bring to light without risking everything. He needed help. Without a word, Ryan pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. Eleanor Green, the retired journalist who had always believed Daniel's innocence. She was the only one who could help him make sense of this, the only one who wouldn't back down. The phone rang twice before she answered. Ryan. Eleanor's voice was cautious, but there was a familiar edge to it. She'd never trusted the official narrative. She'd always suspected something was wrong. "It's about Daniel," Ryan said, his voice tight with emotion. "And Claire, I found something big. We need to meet. Now." There was a pause on the other end, and then Eleanor spoke, her voice low but urgent. "I'll be there." As Ryan hung up the phone, he glanced at Max, who was now pacing back and forth, his eyes darting from Ryan to the woods beyond. Max had done more than just lead him to the evidence. He had shown him the truth, even when no one else would. But as Ryan made his way back to town, his mind kept returning to one question: how far would Dylan go to cover his tracks? As Ryan drove back to town, the weight of the discovery settled on him. The evidence was irrefutable. He had to be careful, though. This was no longer just about proving Daniel's innocence. It was about exposing a powerful lie that had been buried for far too long. Max sat in the passenger seat, his usual calm demeanor replaced with the intense focus Ryan had seen in the dog during their countless walks. Max's gaze was fixed on the road ahead, and every now and then, he would turn his head to stare at Ryan, his eyes as sharp and alert as ever. It was almost as if Max knew that something monumental was about to happen, something that would change their lives forever. The meeting with Eleanor was tense, but Ryan knew she was the key to making sense of the chaos. He met her at the local diner, a small, dimly lit place, where whispers of gossip floated through the air like smoke. The moment Eleanor walked in, her sharp eyes scanning the room, Ryan could feel the pressure building. She had always been ahead of the curve when it came to journalism. She would know what to do with this. Without wasting any time, Ryan slid the box with the lighter and the phone across the table to her. Eleanor's eyes flickered over the items, with a mix of disbelief and determination. She knew what they meant. She could feel it in her gut, just as Ryan had. "Dylan," she whispered, her voice a mixture of frustration and disgust. "He's been involved from the start, hasn't he?" Ryan nodded, his fingers tight around his coffee cup. "There's no question now. We have to expose him before it's too late." Eleanor's expression hardened. "We need to get this to the right people before Dylan has a chance to cover his tracks. He's too connected, too powerful, but we have one advantage: the truth." And Max. Ryan looked over at Max, who had remained eerily calm, as if waiting for the right moment to pounce. The dog's silent presence was enough to make Ryan feel that, no matter how dangerous things got, they weren't alone. Max's growl rumbled low in his throat, almost as if he understood the significance of their conversation. The next few hours were a blur. Eleanor took charge, gathering the evidence they had found. She knew who to contact, who would listen. The local police department was too compromised, but Eleanor had connections with state authorities. She would bring the findings to them, urging them to launch an investigation before the case went any further. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she was determined to expose the truth. As the evening wore on, Ryan found himself filled with an unsettling mix of hope and dread. He knew this was only the beginning. They had the evidence, but Dylan would stop at nothing to protect his secret. There would be threats, danger, and more lies to untangle. But there was one thing that kept Ryan going: the image of Daniel, locked away in a cold, steel cell, counting down the days until his execution. Daniel didn't deserve this. He hadn't done anything wrong, and Ryan had a debt to pay. a debt to a man who had once been a stranger, but who now, in the face of overwhelming injustice, had become a symbol of the fight for truth. As night fell, Ryan drove back to the clearing in the woods, the place where it had all started. Max jumped out of the truck, without being told, heading straight for the spot where they had found the shoes and the box. Ryan stood there for a long moment, looking at the ground where they had found the critical evidence. A chill ran down his spine as he thought about how close they had come to losing it all. They had one shot, one chance to bring Dylan to justice. Max trotted back toward Ryan, sitting beside him as if to say, "We're not done yet." And then it hit Ryan, the one thing they still needed, the DNA. They had the lighter, they had the phone, but without the DNA evidence to prove Dylan's involvement, it wouldn't be enough, not in the eyes of the law. That's when Ryan remembered something else, something that had seemed insignificant at the time. There was a discarded cigarette, but near the moss-covered rock, barely visible beneath the soil. It was old, but it was still fresh enough to contain DNA. Ryan had seen it that first time, but now, it felt like the missing piece of the puzzle. Max stood up, as if sensing the urgency in Ryan's thoughts. They returned to the spot together, and Ryan knelt down to search the ground, feeling around for the cigarette butt. It didn't take long before his fingers brushed against it, hidden beneath the leaves. His heart raced as he carefully picked it up, a sense of triumph flooding through him. This was it, the evidence they needed to put Dylan behind bars for good. The next few days felt like a blur of emotions and events for Daniel, but in the midst of it all, one thing remained certain. The truth was out. Eleanor, relentless and determined, had done what most thought was impossible. She had brought the dark underbelly of the town's corruption into the light. The DNA results came back within 48 hours, and they were a game changer. They matched Dylan. The proof was undeniable. The town that had once been so sure of Daniel's guilt was now reeling in shock. The mayor's son, Dylan, once a beloved figure with an almost untouchable reputation, was suddenly the prime suspect in the murder of Claire Reynolds. For days, the town was divided. Some still held onto the belief that Dylan was innocent, clinging to his clean image and the respect he had built over the years. But there was no denying it anymore. The truth had a way of cutting through the lies, and now there was nowhere left to hide. But as the revelations hit the town like a storm, something else was brewing beneath the surface, a sense of justice. For too long, Daniel had been trapped in the iron grip of an unjust system. His reputation had been destroyed, his life torn apart, but he had always known he was innocent. And now, it wasn't just Daniel's fate that was in question, it was the entire system that had failed him. The final days before Daniel's execution were filled with an intensity that could only be described as unbearable. Every moment stretched on, a looming threat that would have crushed anyone else. But Max, the ever-loyal German Shepherd, was with him every step of the way. Daniel never stopped believing in Max. He had always known that the dog would never let him down. And in the end, it was Max who had played the pivotal role in bringing the truth to light. 3 days before Daniel's execution, just as the weight of his final hours seemed too much to bear, the governor of the state stepped in and issued a stay of execution. The relief was instantaneous, but the road to clearing his name was far from over. The state authorities swiftly launched an official investigation into the mayor's son, Dylan, and his involvement in Claire Reynolds' murder. The town, once quiet and peaceful, was now thrust into chaos. The pressure mounted, with public opinion split and emotions running high. Yet, through it all, one thing was clear. Justice was finally being served. Max, once just a loyal companion, had now become a hero in the eyes of everyone. His actions, his instincts, his courage, his unshakable loyalty had paved the way for the truth to be uncovered. Max had never faltered, even when the world around him seemed to crumble. He had known from the start that something was wrong, and he had never given up on Daniel, even when it felt like the entire world had. When Daniel finally walked out of the prison gates, free at last, it was a moment of pure catharsis. The 2 years he had spent behind bars, locked away for a crime he hadn't committed, had left their mark on him. His once bright eyes now held the weight of the injustice he had endured. His body was thinner, weaker, but his spirit, it was unbroken. He had survived the impossible, and he had survived because of the one constant in his life, Max. As Daniel stepped outside, blinking in the harsh light of the day after so long in the shadows, he saw him. Max was waiting, his tail wagging furiously as if he could hardly believe it himself. The two had been separated by iron bars and lies, but now, standing there together in the sunlight, nothing could keep them apart. Max bounded toward Daniel, leaping into his arms without hesitation, just as he had done countless times before. Daniel sank to his knees, tears streaming down his face. For the first time in 2 long years, he could finally breathe. The years of fear, of anger, of not knowing whether he would ever see this day, had been washed away in an instant. He hugged Max close, his fingers sinking into the dog's fur, as if trying to hold on to the one thing that had kept him sane through it all. Max nuzzled his face, as though saying, "We did it. We made it." The reunion was everything Daniel had imagined and more. Words weren't needed. The silence between them was filled with understanding. Max had never given up on him. Through every dark night in his cell, through every moment of despair, Max had been there in spirit. And now, as Daniel held his best friend, it was as though the weight of the world had been lifted. They were free. The trial, the lies, the injustice, it was all behind them now. But for Daniel and Max, this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a new life, together. Daniel knew that things wouldn't be easy. The town might never fully accept him again. The scars of wrongful imprisonment would linger, and the memories of the past would never fade entirely. But for now, as he walked away from the prison gates with Max by his side, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Together, Daniel and Max were going to rebuild their lives. Together, they would take on whatever the world threw at them. Because nothing, no injustice, no trial, no enemy, could ever break the bond they shared. They had been through hell and come out the other side, stronger than ever. And Max, well, Max had already taught Daniel the most important lesson of all. Loyalty, love, and the pursuit of truth are the greatest powers of all. Don't miss the next incredible story of unbreakable bonds and courage against the odds. Subscribe now and join us for more heartwarming tales of heroism, friendship, and extraordinary animals who change lives.